If you want to understand the exact moment your life breaks and repaints itself in a color you don't recognize, come stand where I stood at my daughter's graduation under the worst kind of spotlight. Imagine the hall, banners, proud faces, my little girl in cap and gown, the air thick with applause and the kind of hope you can taste. Now imagine the man you trusted walking up to the podium, smiling like he's about to hand her the world and instead announcing he's marrying someone else, a young, bright woman, energetic. A new beginning, he called it, as if our years together were an expired dress he'd tossed aside. Tears rolled down my daughter's cheeks in front of everyone. People who'd hugged me years ago for coffee and small talk watched the scene unfold like a slow public stain. My husband's words were surgical. They cut the air, cut our history, and left me exposed. I felt everyone's eyes on me pity, curiosity, the delicious cruelty of strangers who live for other people's collapses. For a moment, I considered the simplest revenge roar, scream, rip his suit, stain his moment with the kind of spectacle that becomes cheap legend. But I remembered something my mother taught me when she was broken and fierce. Don't feed the animal with drama, starve it until it begs. So I did the opposite. I wiped my face. I stood. I applauded with precisely measured hands. In the quiet between grief and action, a plan assembled like frost on glass. Delicate, sharp, inevitable. I moved through those next days like a ghost with a ledger. The first thing I did was gather proof, not to make him suffer in the gutter, but to build a future that would make him understand how much he'd gambled away. Receipts, messages, names, little things men think women ignore. I put them in a folder called Tomorrow. I did not tell a soul. I did not call the friends who might panic. I did not cry on shoulders that would only become gossip. Instead, I rebuilt the story the world had for me. I learned the things he assumed a scorned wife would never learn: tax deadlines, corporate names, the language of contracts. I dusted off a patience that had been mistaken for weakness. Outside, I smiled for my daughter and answered the stupid kindnesses about, "How is Sharon holding up?" with the same line I'd practiced until it became armor. "We'll be fine." Inside, I was mapping every ledger line where he had been careless. Business loans in my name, joint accounts with holes, phone numbers that whispered of someone else's late night laughter. People told me to leave. People told me to confront him. People offered platitudes and pity. I took none of it. Instead, I became a quiet hurricane. I sold small things he thought meaningless, not out of spite, out of practicality. I rerouted payments without drama. I called lawyers for advice under the pretense of what ifs. I met with an old friend from university who had become a woman of numbers and steel, and I took notes like a student learning a new language. Everything that looked trivial to him became a thread I could pull. And while I stitched the safety net, I fed him exactly what he wanted: to believe he'd won. He grew careless with his arrogance, drunk on the attention of the new woman and the whisper thrill that came with beginning again at 50. That arrogance is a thing that has weight. You can feel it in the way he sat, the way he left his phone unlocked, the way he began to assume audiences. People like him don't plan for women who plan. The first domino fell because of his arrogance and a careless dinner where he celebrated the new life he imagined. He posted a photo, triumphant, of champagne, laughter, and a ring that caught the light like a spotlight. In the comments, an old account I controlled liked the photo. He saw the like and felt it like a small god. He laughed and sent another boast to my inbox. "You should be happy for me." I stared at the words and smiled with the kind of cold I'd been collecting for weeks. "I already am," I wrote back. "I hope she makes you very happy." He did not know that a smile can hold a ledger. He did not know that calm is a kind of weapon you brandish by mastery. He did not know that the woman he thought ruined was the architect of his undoing, and that when the house falls, he would be the one begging under the rubble, while everyone else reads the headlines I had written for him. The second act began at a dinner I wasn't invited to. He held court, surrounded by people who loved shiny things and new narratives. The new wife, bright hair, brighter laugh, hung on his flattery like a trophy. He was careless with names, careless with digital footprints, careless with the truth. Careless people always leave traces. I followed the traces. I started with subtle strikes, a message to his business partner, not accusatory, just a question. "Can you confirm the latest on the partnership filings?" I've lost track, the partner replied, kindly, assuming I was the worried spouse. That small, polite reply gave me the exact clause that hadn't been filed. I phoned the accountant for the nonprofit he'd claimed to support and asked for a simple donation receipt for tax purposes. The accountant, confused, sent a PDF. It showed funds moving in ways his public persona never hinted. I did not shout. I did not expose. I documented. Then I did what he would never expect. I weaponized dignity. On the day he announced their engagement at a flashy rooftop party, a night he invited the world to watch him step into his new life, I sent an elegant invitation to everyone who mattered in our town, to our daughter's teachers, to the business partners he bragged about, to the women who had once confided small betrayals over coffee. The invitation's subject line read simply, "An evening of gratitude, Sharon's Gala." He scoffed when he got the invite by way of gossip, laughed about how ridiculous I was. He loved gossip, too. It made him look above it. The gala never existed, but the rumor did. People began to wonder why, in the middle of his pageant, there was a talk going on about charity, legacy, and the power of honest names. This was the first time his shiny narrative met the quiet, steady drum of those who remembered how he behaved when no one looked. Invitations find people with memories, memories opened like old wounds. 2 weeks later, I released a dossier, not full of salacious lies, but of simple, undeniable facts: late payments, transfers to shell accounts, names of contractors hired and paid with money that should have been accounted to the business he claimed to run honorably. I sent copies to his partner, the bank, and to a small, respected local journalist who owed me nothing. I didn't write an inflammatory headline. I wrote a timeline. I let the timeline speak for me. The journalist called with a voice that held something between curiosity and horror. "Sharon, are you sure?" he asked. I said, "Read it." When the first article hit, it read like a careful dissection: numbers, dates, quotes. It wasn't revenge in the tabloid sense, it was accountability, and the town noticed. The new fiancée called me hysterical and angry. Her calls were hung up by a secretary who mistook her for a telemarketer. Small tremors became larger ones. His supporters began to look sideways. Sponsors asked questions. His partner scheduled a meeting the following morning. The kind of meeting where men in suits ask you to explain your life choices to restore a balance they pretend you broke. He came home that night with a swagger that had lost its edge. He tried to laugh it off. He tried to tell their friends we were having a little dust-up, nothing to see. But pride is brittle. Under his bravado, I could see panic like a live wire. He began to check his phone compulsively. He stopped posting. And the bright new woman, she began to walk a little slower, to watch the door, to whisper concerns when she thought no one heard. I did not humiliate him publicly. I let the public humiliate him by doing what public platforms do best: ask questions. I let his world unravel in polite, ordinary ways. Meetings were rescheduled. A contract was put on hold. The woman who once laughed at how free he was now walked through rooms and felt like an intruder. She had not known the architecture of his lies. She only loved the scaffolding. My daughter watched all this with a clarity that hurt me more than his initial betrayal. She saw how I moved, how I kept my voice steady, how I chose actions over spectacle. She began to stand straighter. The shame he'd put on her once became a lesson in resilience. When he finally realized this was not a mere storm, he tried the predictable dance: apologies offered in private, promises to change, tears that smelled of old wine. I listened to him stumble through words that had once been our vows, and I let him ramble. Begging is a sound I've heard before, from others, from him. But begging without consequence is what taught men to betray. I had built consequence. I had waited for leverage that was clean and legal and devastating in its honesty. But even then, I kept one truth to myself: revenge is not satisfaction, it is clarity. I wanted him to understand, in the bone-deep way that ruins comfort, that he had traded respect for an illusion. He begged first with flowers and whispered promises in hallways, then with lawyers. He thought legality could paper over the mess. He filed claims, letters, threats. That was the moment I realized our fight had become larger than us. It had become a lesson to every woman who had swallowed silence to keep a marriage intact. He expected me to crumble at the scent of paper. Instead, I answered with documents, counterstatements, and a slow, relentless transparency. I made one final move that would not humiliate him with petty spectacle, but would dismantle the version of himself he had been parading. I gathered people who had known us when we were young and honest and asked them to speak privately, not to me, but to our daughter. I asked them to tell her the truth about who he had been when he was not trying to be admired. I told them to be kind but truthful. I wanted my daughter to have the map of her father before the vanity had rewritten every page. At the same time, I arranged a meeting at the school, a simple parent-teacher coffee, nothing more, and invited journalists under the guise of community interest. The school obliged. They were proud of the attention their students drew. On that day, as our daughter sat between two women who once taught her to tie her ribbon, the journalist asked a harmless question about parenting and responsibility. It was an ordinary question, and then a cascade of small truths followed. A timeline, a recollection, an invoice, a volunteer log. Each small truth did not shout. It whispered with the authority of witnesses. By the time he realized what had happened, his world had been rearranged into a mirror he could not avoid. She left him first, not the bright new woman, who had by then learned too much, but the public. Sponsors rescinded their support. Invitations he expected no longer arrived. His friends, who had loved his bravado, now kept polite distance, like that of people who wouldn't touch a burned dish. He called me on the phone once and begged, voice raw and small. He pleaded for a meeting. He wanted to know how to fix what he'd broken. I listened. I felt nothing like triumph. I felt the cool, sober satisfaction of a woman who had taken back the terms of her life. When we met, he was diminished not by my words, but by the evident exhaustion of a man who had tried to outrun consequence. He asked for forgiveness like a surgeon asking for the right to malpractice again. Sharon, I made a mistake. She means nothing. I was selfish. Tell me what to do. I looked at him across the table, at the man who'd loved me in small ways for years, and then dismissed those years for a flash. I told him two things and meant both. You will apologize to our daughter first, publicly and honestly. You will accept what you have lost and stop asking to reclaim it. Then, if you are serious about making amends, there are steps you will take that show change, not words. He tried the theatrics, groveling for pity, begging for a reprieve. I would not give him melodrama. I asked for actions, restitution where he had been careless, transparency where he had lied, and most importantly, time. Time teaches the proud humility. He nodded like a man drowning, and for a while the pleading filled the space between us. He offered money. I refused. He offered a promise. I required proof. He wanted my forgiveness like a short-term pass. I told him forgiveness must be earned, and that while I was capable of it, it would not be given to soothe his ego. When he finally went on his knees, a cliche I had imagined once and now saw out of context, it was nothing but a physical motion. Begging does not equal understanding, but it is a start for the unready. He left that day a man hollowed by consequence and staring at the slow collapse of the life he used to take for granted. My daughter watched him leave, and in her eyes I saw something that steadied the tremor in my chest. She would not be broken by another man's spectacle. In the quiet that followed, I sat with my daughter, and we cried for what we had lost. Not just a husband, not just a father as he pretended, but the easy, unquestioning future that had been promised to us. Then we made a new promise, to ourselves, to each other, that dignity would guide our choices, not drama. I had wanted him to regret, and he did. But the thing I cherished more was that my daughter learned the lesson of strength without rage. You can be broken and still be the one who rebuilds. If you felt the sting, the shock, the slow burn of this story, you're not alone. If you've been humiliated in front of people who were meant to protect you, remember this. Revenge tastes sweetest when it's served as justice, quietly and precisely. If you want more stories like Sharon's, raw, true, and unflinching, like, share, and subscribe. Support the channel via the link in the description so we can keep telling the stories that don't get told.